Hello and welcome to Extra Minutes, the 60 Minutes podcast. I'm Amelia Adams and I'm here with producer Sammi Taylor. Hi, Sammi.
Amelia, how are you?
I'm really well. We're trying something a little bit new. In fact, it's also a little bit old because many of our viewers might remember that years ago, 60 Minutes would close every show with Peter Harvey's Mailbag, which was one of my absolute favourite segments.
Me too.
Viewers would write in those days and would share your feedback.
For most of us, it came out of the blue, and most of you wished it had stayed there. It's called attachment parenting. Thanks for showing us what the new generation is going to be like. Rude and demanding, with no sense of respect for their parents or anybody else. What's happened to real parenting? Understandably, devotees of this controversial parenting philosophy have a very different view. It's the ideal way to grow healthy, happy, well-adjusted adults, without the violence and fear that comes with smacking and time-outs.
So we're doing that again on the podcast, but of course these days it's all Facebook and Instagram. We can't share all the comments, but we're aiming to get a cross-section of positive and negative. And a story that you and I worked together on in 2023 with producer Tracy Hannaford got so much feedback, and probably one of the most controversial stories I've done in my time at 60 Minutes, and that was on gender creative parenting. We will explain what that means in a moment. But, you know, close to 40,000 comments.
Yeah.
Why do you think this riled people up so much?
It just got such a reaction.
Didn't
And it
it?
got a reaction at the time that the story went to air. And I think it continues to get a reaction online every single time, you know, the story kind of is reposted or rediscovered through any of our channels.
And anytime there's something in the news or something in politics, which I
Yeah.
think focuses on, you know, gender or inequality or recognition of the sexes or whatever it might be,
kind of reignites
Yeah.
the debate again. And it gets pretty heated.
look, a lot of these comments, I have to say, were mostly negative. There was a lot of shock, confusion and sadness. Some were just too unpleasant to even share with you. But we'll give you a little example. Our viewers writing, "Good grief, this is absolute utter insanity. This is insane. This is whack. We live in a confused world. Why is 60 Minutes even giving this a platform?" And I think that's an important one for us to address. We obviously tackle a range of stories that are, you know, fun, interesting, entertaining, also deeply political, human interest, tragedy, but also controversial stories like this one.
Yeah.
It's an issue story, which I think made it quite hard for us in the
Yeah, it
production
was.
and the scripting process, which we'll get to.
Well, I think it was also just a new kind of topic for us to
Yes.
wrestle with in the first place. And then you open that conversation up when you put the story to air. I think, you know, someone asking why we gave it a platform, well, you know, 37,000 people commented on the story and had something to say about it. It really, you know,
It hit a nerve,
Yeah.
I think. And, you know, the concept of gender creative parenting is relatively new, and it has been gaining traction in the States, which is where we went to hang out with our lovely family in Portland, and also a family in Adelaide who are trying this. And as they describe it, it is basically you keep your child's gender, reproductive anatomy, a secret from
Yes.
birth. You don't tell people this is a boy or a girl. I think in one of our families, actually, they didn't even tell the grandparents.
yes.
Hospital staff were instructed, we do not label this child boy or girl. We do not, you know, grandparents aren't allowed to change nappies.
Yep.
Which might sound extreme, but this is the way that they felt.
Yeah.
They would not have assumptions made upon the child,
Yes.
and they would therefore be able to let the child grow up making their own choices in terms of, you know, clothing, activities, toys, games, and then at some point, you know, as a toddler or a, you know, little kid, to make that decision themselves. This is how I want to be addressed. I'm a he, him, or a she, her.
Yes.
So it is extremely controversial, and it's something that I think really challenges our concept of parenting.
Yeah, I think something in thinking back to when we were filming with Danny and Amy, the Australian couple that we spent some time with,
Yes.
they said that, you know, it was a decision that they made to not share the sex of their child only a couple of days before Amy gave birth.
That's right.
And that it kind of even took Amy by surprise that they were going to really, they'd made that rule and they were going to stick to it.
The experience of having raised Evie and what we saw happen to Evie and the assumptions that were put on Evie as a girl were things that we weren't that comfortable with.
I said to Danny, are we going to tell people the sex of Bertie or the baby that we haven't yet had? And Danny was, quite unequivocal.
Yes, I said no. I said let's just not tell people.
Which was a bit of a shock because it was just a few days before, before I was giving birth.
And we hung out with Bertie. She was
with Bertie.
This is the thing
with this story, and we did do this a lot because you're kind of conditioned as the way kind of that we were brought up,
Bertie looks,
the way that Bertie looks, and some of the things that Bertie loves, Frozen, and fairies.
So when we were shooting with Bertie, they were 3.5, and they loved dresses and Frozen and all those things.
Yeah.
So I automatically would be referring to them as a her.
But I think it's an important kind of point to make is that we were not getting the pronouns thing right every single time from the beginning. It is a little bit of a adjustment that you make in your brain, and it's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just the way that we refer to Bertie and the way that Bertie, Bertie's family wanted them to be referred to.
Yes. We've got quite a few comments around, is this actually parenting? Sam has written, they can't have social media until they're 16. They can't get a tattoo, drink or vote until they're 18, but they can decide their gender. Fair point.
Yep.
I grew up in a world where parents are there to lead their children, not children lead their parents. I did struggle with this. And in fact, in speaking to Kyle, the mother in Portland, and we spent quite a lot of time with Kyle and her partner and Zuma. And little Zuma was 6 when we were filming with them, and they've since had a new addition to their family. But Zuma came home at, pretty sure it was 3 or 4 years old, came home from preschool one day and said, I really like him. I think I'm a boy. And they said, okay, cool, let's go with that. And until that point, she'd even done things like written letters to all the parents in his playgroup. Because you think of how you keep this going. Like, the baby's born, it's in hospital, you're not telling anyone its reproductive anatomy. But then, throughout socialising and childcare and all those things, how do you actually manage that? So Kyle was very open about that. She'd written to other parents saying, this is what we're doing. Zuma's not a boy or a girl. Zuma's just a child. Zuma will choose their own way in time. And Zuma did, in fact, come home and say, I'm a boy now. We still don't know what Zuma's anatomy was, and it doesn't really matter. And I think that's the point that Kyle was making.
We didn't assign a gender at birth, and we didn't disclose Zuma's reproductive anatomy to people who didn't need to know. The reproductive anatomy that my kiddo was born with, I didn't want to assign too many labels and assumptions and, destinies on top of that.
Well, and I think it's also the point that perhaps some of our commenters are getting really stuck on, this idea that, it has to be so binary or set that, that that's kind of just the way that things are. You're a boy or you're a girl, and those are your options. And I think, some of the reaction has been quite aggressive and quite, I think there is a lot of confusion around some of this as well, confusion about what gender is versus what sex is. Sex obviously refers to, the reproductive anatomy that we're born with.
And a lot of comments around, the children are too young for this. It's adding a whole layer. And, I said to Carla, I don't think it made the final cut of the story, but I remember saying to her, my daughter, who was at the time 6, same age as Zuma, I said, my daughter will say to me, I'm a unicorn, I'm a dolphin. Now, it's up to me as a parent to say, oh, yeah, we can play that game, but you're actually not a dolphin. Yeah. You're a little girl. And these are the facts.
Yeah.
But everyone sees it differently. And I think, we did tackle some of this confusion in our story with several experts. We had a psychotherapist and a neuroscientist.
That's right.
They had differing views, which was interesting, but one thing they both agreed on was that this is really an experiment.
Well, and it's something that is obviously not being done. It's gaining more traction, and there are definitely more families around the world that are, you know, exploring gender creative parenting and interested in that. But most parents are sending their children to preschool or to school as a little boy or as a little girl. That's just the majority of,
And I think that's
what goes on.
You know, this viewer writes, all good and well until they walk out the door and encounter the realities of the world.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the point, isn't it?
And I think Danny and Amy made that point to us as well, that, you know, Bertie is who Bertie is.
Yep.
And when we met Bertie, they were only, I think, 3.5. You know, Bertie hasn't kind of socialized with the outside world.
Too much.
You know, there are going to be different kinds of stereotypes or expectations or kind of things that happen throughout Bertie's life that will lead, you know, Bertie in different directions.
Yep, that's right. We should read out too some of the comments in support of this style of parenting. Frankly, Sammi says, you know, she's still treating her child like a human. She's just not pushing gender norms. It's not really that big a deal.
I like that this here is a response to a comment. So somebody says, poor kids, why complicate their lives? They will need therapy, but better yet, they'll need God.
Dramatic.
It's very dramatic. But, you know, people have then kind of shared that there are different ways of parenting, and we've used different parenting styles throughout lots of different cultures and lots of different communities, and things are going to be done differently, you know.
Something that we as a society, I think, love to judge on.
Yes.
And I feel like that's why this has created such a storm.
Absolutely.
Because people love to judge other people's parenting. You know,
Yes,
you jump on
exactly.
Instagram, you're like, oh, I never put that in my son's lunchbox or whatever it is. And this is like a really insanely specific, controversial
Yes.
parenting decision.
People have very strong opinions about this, and look, they're entitled to share those opinions. I think one of the other comments here is, you know, quite almost philosophical. Says the best way to manage this is just to go with the flow. Respect the kiddo as a whole person. Don't be judgmental of them. Gender expression is a pretty wide spectrum. You can give them names and pronouns, but be okay with that changing. I think that's a really important point to make too, that even, you know, some children that are raised, you know, with their biological sex matching their gender are going to, you know, choose a different path maybe later down the track.
Absolutely.
I also think that that's why this story gets, you know, so much of a reaction, is that when, you know, it starts to kind of tie into what we know about sex, what we know about gender, what we know about, you know, transgender.
Yeah.
It really, you know, riles people up.
I think that's important, and I think that is really the guts of what our families in the story were hoping to communicate and hoping to show viewers, is that the world is limitless. You know, they don't want their child to be limited by choices and toys and essentially gender, and that they are at the very heart of it. And I think we both saw this. Very loved.
Oh, absolutely.
Children.
I was going to say Bertie was, you know, a delight to spend time with, and Zuma. And, you know, these are kids that are being raised obviously differently to perhaps what some of our commenters are used to.
But very happy families.
In homes that are filled with love and with care and with support.
And they don't have parents saying, no, you can't play with that truck.
Exactly.
Or no, you can't wear a dress. In fact, their parents are saying, you know what? Try everything. Go the full spectrum. See how you feel.
Yep.
Some people say what you're doing is child abuse. We're not, you know, but we're Zoomer has grown up in an environment where he has access to explore his interests without shame, without force, right? He can gravitate towards anything that intrigues him, to wear, to play with, to dream up as, you know, like a career he might want to have someday. And we say, that's awesome, instead of saying, you can't do that because your body, because of your gender, right?
It hasn't been a popular style of parenting for long enough for us to have any long-term data. And that is the one thing that our experts came back to. We don't know yet, and I'd love to, and maybe I will in a few years, go and catch up with our families.
Yeah.
And I'd love to ask Zuma when he's actually 25.
Exactly.
What was that like for you?
Exactly.
Until we have that data, I think it's very hard to say this has got negative long-term impacts, or do you know what? This is totally fine. So I guess it's a wait and see. But one thing that we do know for certain is that this hits such a nerve.
Yep.
It gets so much judgment. It gets so many comments, and we're endlessly interested to hear what you think. So please do continue to share your comments with us. And if you haven't watched the story or you want to catch up on it just to rile yourself up all over again, you can do so on our 60 Minutes YouTube channel or on 9 Now.